Vietnam to fulfill one of the most solemn pledges of the American nation, to help defend this small and valiant nation.
The Vietnam War tore apart our nation.
For the first time in our nation's history, the enemy is about to win a war where Americans fought and died.
A decade of agony took the lives of more than 58,000 Americans.
Do you think that those lives were wasted?
I think it's a great tragedy, what we're seeing in Vietnam today. I think it could have been avoided.
And countless Vietnamese children orphaned in the chaos of the war's final weeks.
There was sort of this immediate sense of panic to get the kids out.
But a plan was put into action to save them. Operation Babylift.
I have directed that C-5A aircraft, especially equipped to care for these orphans, be sent to Saigon.
But the first plane out of Saigon crashed.
I remember I didn't have my feet on the rudder pedals and they went bam.
We saw this great explosion and black cloud at the end of the runway.
But of course, at that point, we didn't know who had left on that flight. Did anybody survive?
It could have been sabotage. So as we were loading the babies, we were patting them down to make sure that they did not have any explosives.
50 years later, those survivors and their families remember the journey.
I don't have a hospital bracelet. I don't have a little lock of hair when I came home. What I have are front page New York Times articles, and I have survival manifests. That's my baby records.
Welcome to this special presentation, The Vietnam War, Flight to a New Future.
We are in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, formerly known as Saigon. I'm Jeremy Hubbard. 50 years ago, one of the most iconic photographs of the last century was taken on this very street as dozens of evacuees climbed a ladder, desperately trying to flee this city shortly before it fell to North Vietnamese troops.
Direct U.S. involvement began in the 1960s. The U.S. supported the anti-communist forces in South Vietnam as they fought against Ho Chi Minh and his communist forces in the north. As the conflict escalated, the U.S. began deploying ground troops. The number of American soldiers in Vietnam surged to more than 500,000 by 1969. But even with all those soldiers, the war proved difficult, with rebels in the south known as the Viet Cong using guerrilla warfare tactics. It became increasingly unpopular at home, with widespread protests happening nationwide. In 1975, after the U.S. fully withdrew, the North Vietnamese Army launched a final offensive. On April 30th, the capital city of Saigon fell to the north, marking the end of the Vietnam War and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule.
But before Saigon fell, then President Gerald Ford authorized the evacuation of thousands of Vietnamese orphans. It became known as Operation Babylift, with the first flight out of Saigon on April 4th, 1975.
These orphans will be flown to Travis Air Force Base in California and other bases on the West Coast and cared for in those locations. These 2,000 Vietnamese orphans are all in the process of being adopted by American families.
Many of them were frail, weak, malnourished little babies. But to Sister Mary Nell Gage, they were precious cargo.
Pan Am's last flight out.
The littlest victims of the Vietnam War.
We had 4 children on that flight.
Abandoned orphans, she helped get out of the country.
How can we do this? This is just an impossible task.
In the desperate final days of the war, with Viet Cong forces closing in and Saigon about to fall,
we did everything we could.
She's part of Sisters of Loretto, a Catholic religious order with a sacred mission. The children lived in deplorable conditions.
Diapers hanging everywhere, and the aroma was such that I'm thinking, whoa, I don't know about this.
Sister Gage helped arrange adoptions for thousands of Vietnamese orphans as one of the first organizers of what would eventually become known as Operation Babylift.
These children on the plane.
Families all over the world anxiously awaiting their arrival.
And those are 2 children who went to France. We had children leaving every week.
She returned to the U.S., a chance to catch her breath and work back home, processing the orphans on their arrival. Around that time, she overheard a phone call that upended her life.
One of our sisters, she's on the phone with her back to me, and I hear her say, "I will keep this from Mary Nell as long as I can."
It was April 4th, 1975, when a C-5 Air Force jet loaded with Vietnamese orphans being evacuated to the U.S. crashed just outside Saigon.
Everybody that's circled here, did they die in the crash?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah. There's Dolly, who died in the plane, Birgit.
Amazingly, more than 170 people survived, including babies and children. Through heartbreak and grief, she met the next plane load of hundreds of children on a Pan Am flight the very next day, arriving in the U.S.
It's a gift that you can hardly hope for.
For a half century, those frantic final days of the Vietnam War and the desperate effort to save the children have in many ways defined Sister Gage's life, faith, and focus.
You see these little faces, it's hard to believe they're all 50+ years old now, right?
Oh, isn't that the truth? Oh, my.
She still stays in touch with many of the children she helped get out of Vietnam.
I think the fact that they are a survivor of an horrendous event has given them an extra purpose.
Along the way, helping to fill the blank pages of their life story wherever she can.
What a gift.
This small memorial now marks the spot where that C-5 plane carrying the first wave of children out of Saigon crashed. Bud Traynor was commander of that flight when a catastrophic malfunction blew open the cargo door.
They generally never sent the C-5 in. It was just too easy for somebody to pick off.
But Captain Bud Traynor got his orders.
What we want is for you to take a retrograde cargo out of Saigon. Okay, what? Well, people. We want you to go figure out how many you can take. We're used to working in tons, not in people. So we went back and we said, you know, I'll bet we could take 2,000 people. And I'm talking about putting them in standing up because the weight wouldn't be a factor. Well, they're going to be children. What? What? Yeah, they're going to be children. And all of a sudden, everybody got serious and they went out and raided the BX and commissary. And they brought the people out in these blue school buses. That's the C-5 itself.
The time came to load the babies and children on the cargo plane.
Upstairs in the troop compartment, and in all of the 73 seats, we would put 2 kids, a pillow, a juice, seatbelt. Next seat, same thing. If the kids were old enough, facile enough to undo their seatbelt and start messing around, we took them out, put them downstairs.
They put as many children on the plane as possible.
They are literally sitting on the floor on blankets or along a catwalk that goes all the way down both sides. They kept promising this right up to the very end, that they'd give me a manifest of the kids, and they never did. We didn't go click, click, click as they walked in the door. I never had a clue other than, that looks like a lot.
Then they got clearance to take off.
Because of the missile threat, we took off slowly and climbed as fast as we could. We had just crossed Vung Tau, maybe 2 or 3 minutes passed, and we're now out over the water. There was a loud bang, the cockpit filled with condensation, and I remember I didn't have my feet on the rudder pedals, and they went bam. The co-pilot was putting on his oxygen mask. I said, yeah, that's probably what I should do too. So you reach over and you put the oxygen mask on. I deployed a scanner. He described the back of the airplane as a big gaping hole with the flight control cables fluttering out the back like spaghetti.
It was time to try to land.
Yeah, I'm pulling, and of course nothing's happening. And now I'm really getting go fast. And faster and faster, and I'm looking down at Vung Tau is right down in front of me, and I'm thinking, I don't want to become a permanent fixture down by the gate shack.
The C-5 was coming in for a landing at about 311 miles per hour.
And suddenly the airplane rolls, and it coasted in like a toboggan and left these big long tracks in the dirt. We turned around, came to a stop, cranked open the window, and stepped out. And normally the flight deck would be 33 feet in the air, and of course I'm just stepping right out. And I look back along the side of the flight deck, then I see the wings burning. So I walked, toward the fire. I was hoping to find live kids. I did not. Other people had gone out toward the fire and then looked over, and 100 yards away was the troop compartment.
That compartment is where the children survived. Air America was on scene in about 4 minutes after listening to the transmission.
A nurse and a med tech were trapped in the wreckage, and we got a bunch of local people that were out there and fastened some tie-down chains to the wreckage of where the crew door was, and we ended up, heave, and each time we could extract the two crewmen out of there. We did get them out of there.
As for the cause of the crash, the rear cargo door locks failed after routine maintenance just before the Babylift mission.
It breaks apart, breaks the pressure door, and they took off the locks. But when they put them back on, they didn't re-rig the doors.
After guiding the crippled C-5 in a crash landing, Captain Bud Traynor was credited with the survival of more than 170 people on board. He received the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism and airmanship.
I don't think any of the crew took, ownership of the deaths. They took ownership of the lives. The tail is up here, and this little thing that looks like a Quonset hut is where all the kids survived. And let me see, what do we got here? You can see this is all that's left of the cargo compartment. Virtually nothing.
And after 50 years, it is difficult to remember everything about Operation Babylift's first flight out.
But other things are pretty much burned into your memory. I'm pretty sure I'll never forget some of the feeling in that 15 minutes between the rapid decompression and hitting the ground. It was quite something.
Next, searching for clues of a past lost in the devastation of war. And
we're going to assign you one of these babies across the desk in Denver, or you can walk into the next room and choose assignment.
how one nurse helping with the evacuation of hundreds of orphans found a new purpose after meeting one young boy.
I am assured that all bureaucratic red tape is being eliminated and that we will make a total effort to see to it that South Vietnamese war orphans are brought to the United States.
One of the babies who survived that C-5 plane crash here in Vietnam was Erin Lockhart, and when the plane went down right at this spot, so did the details of her birth.
These are letters my parents received from Sister Ursula. These are really, really precious to me.
These tattered 50-year-old envelopes from an orphanage in Vietnam hold the few clues to Erin Lockhart's origin.
You're very welcome to our best baby who will travel under Phong's name. I hope this move of mine doesn't shock you, just wanting to get the baby home to you soon.
They were sent from a nun named Sister Ursula to an adoptive couple in the United States, anxiously awaiting Erin's evacuation from Vietnam.
In those letters, it says that they changed me out a couple times and I traveled on somebody else's paperwork. So I 100% don't even know my actual birth date. I know absolutely nothing. And so there's a lot of holes in my particular story.
Holes ripped open wide when that Operation Babylift C-5 plane crashed outside Saigon.
What I've found when I've met a lot of other adoptees is we just have this gaping hole in our history, and we learn to live with it, and some of us manage it in different ways.
So back in 1997, in the early days of the internet, Erin did an online search for Operation Babylift.
There's so many people that were connected to this, you know.
She made contact with the medical crew director on that flight, Regina Auney, who it turns out likely held Erin in her arms the day of the crash. And she eventually met pilot Bud Traynor and some other crew members too. Finally, some of those holes started to get filled in.
My focus was sort of taking all these pieces of the puzzle and putting them all together. I think I'm going to try to find birth family because this is probably my last opportunity. But I think the smart thing and what is just to keep, the expectations kind of low.
Reality is she may never know exactly how her life story begins. But what she does know is the story already has a happy ending.
growing up with a loving family.
I feel so fortunate that there were folks on the ground that were kind of doing whatever they could just to kind of get us out of there.
And now she even has a family of her own.
I really felt like I wanted to pay it forward. I just couldn't imagine my life without them.
Countless adoptees have tried to track down loved ones here in Vietnam, but for many it's an insurmountable task. Records lost or destroyed in the war, relatives killed, a lack of DNA testing, all standing in the way of a reunion. But one Colorado woman did manage to track down her birth relatives, including her father.
Me and my full brother and then my dad.
This photograph captures the moment Joy Lay waited 42 years for, finally meeting her birth dad in person.
I love this picture.
It was the culmination of a lifetime of confusion, curiosity, and so many questions.
As much as people are always looking for truth, there's also that hesitation.
Born in Vietnam to a Vietnamese father and a Cambodian mother, she was sent to live in an orphanage. She didn't know anything about her birth parents, didn't know what town she was from, didn't even know her birthday. Then DNA testing came into the picture.
And I was given my test in 2010 when we did a reunion with a bunch of adoptees. And I came back and I didn't take it for like a year. I think there's some fear in kind of knowing the answers. So this is my original passport.
Eventually, Joy took that DNA test, and it helped fill in the blank pages of her life story.
Ultimately, I came back with a match that they had found my brothers. And then from there, my biological father.
Here in the Vietnamese countryside, in the small home that he built by himself and by hand, sat a 90-year-old stranger. At long last, this was Joy's birth father.
So he knew who I was. He could say that I was Dot's is my brother, my Dot's sister, and that I was Cambodian. But other than that, I couldn't communicate too much with him.
About 8 months after this life-changing encounter, he died.
You always want to know, and I think that I'm really lucky that I do know. There's not that many of us that actually did find biological family again.
That's why Joy found a way to honor the man she barely knew.
I changed my last name to be that of my dad's last name. Most of the work I've done as a professor or as a teacher and educator has really been about culture and identity. And having adopted identities or having adopted names or married names never truly felt like mine. And so finally I was able to say, this is my last name. This is the name that my father had.
That is Leanne Thiemann, loaded into the back of a van in Saigon with 22 Vietnamese orphans scattered across the car seats and floorboard on a desperate mission to get out of that country in the final days of the Vietnam War.
And we had to get the babies to the airport, and we had about 100 at that time. As the photo shows, it fits 22 babies. Who knew?
Back in 1975, Leanne was a nurse when she volunteered to travel with an adoption agency to help care for hundreds of adoptees and bring them to their new families and new lives in America.
When I had agreed to go, bombing was 100 miles outside of Saigon. But the day before I left, there was bombing within 1 mile of the Saigon city limits, and that's when I got afraid.
She spent just 5 life-changing days in Vietnam. She was supposed to be on that first C-5 cargo plane out of the country as part of the operation, but she got bumped from that flight.
I stood on the runway and watched as the first plane load of orphans, the one I had begged to be on, crash after takeoff, killing half of the 300 babies and volunteers on board. And when that plane crashed, so did I.
Even as investigators sifted through that wreckage, volunteers like Leanne continued their work, evacuating more children. So many, they had to place the smallest kids in cardboard boxes. Turns out Leanne would be coming home with some additional precious cargo of her own.
To my surprise, the next day is when the director said, we're going to assign you one of these babies across the desk in Denver, or you can walk into the next room and choose a son. But the good news is I didn't have to, because he picked me. And I walked into that room of 100 babies. That little booger took one look at me, and he got down on his hands and knees, and he crawled right across the room into my arms, my heart, and our family. We had a son.
That son, Mitch, is now 50 years old.
He lives in Austin, and he does software work for a big grocery chain. He's wonderful.
Hard for her to believe it's been that long since the airlift that changed countless lives, and since she spent those 5 days in Vietnam that have impacted every day of her life since.
The biggest question for me was, when do we leave?
In the chaos of the fall of Saigon, one man helped get hundreds of people on the last commercial flight out of the war-torn country. And we introduce you to one of the children who made it on that flight.
But I can assure you that we intend to do everything possible in that humanitarian effort.
In early April 1975, two Pan Am 747s made their way out of South Vietnam, one after the other, each filled with hundreds of orphans headed to the U.S. for adoption.
Overseeing these flights to a new future was Pan Am Director of Operations Alan Topping, who also played a role in arranging the final flight out of Saigon.
When I arrived in Vietnam, we still had 25,000 U.S. troops there.
Alan Topping worked for Pan Am in San Francisco with his sights set on a station manager job. Then one opened up in Vietnam.
My immediate response was no. I didn't want to go out there because, you know, it's a war zone. I went over in November of '72, and sure enough, in January of '73, they did sign a peace agreement, and the war was officially over. But in reality, it was, I think, destined to fail. So that first night, I was listening if the bombs would still be falling, and sure enough, they were still dropping bombs in spite of the agreement.
In fact, that agreement did fail. It took 2 more years, but the South finally fell to the North Vietnamese.
The biggest question for me was, when do we leave? How do you get your employees and their families out with the South Vietnamese government basically falling apart, but still in charge?
But before Topping helped his employees and other Americans on the last flight out of Vietnam, he helped with the evacuation of children from an orphanage in Saigon.
I'll never forget that day when we were loading that airplane that crashed, when we were loading those kids on. We, at that point, did not know what caused the malfunction, and it could have been sabotage. So as we were loading the babies, we were patting them down to make sure that they did not have any explosives in the diapers. Within 24 hours of that accident, we operated 2 747s from Saigon to the United States with close to 700 babies and volunteers.
Those 2 747s full of adoptees arrived safely in the States, triggering an unusual idea to get the Pan Am employees out of the country.
I told our human resources manager to go down to the foreign ministry and find out, what do I have to do to adopt our employees? And he looked at me like I lost it. I signed all the documents. I had no idea what I was signing. I just signed everything. He took it back downtown, and they approved it.
The last Pan Am flight out of Vietnam was April 24th, 1975. It was a day of normal flight operations.
So it wouldn't create any suspicion that we're operating on a non-scheduled day and cause a real panic. And we're sitting at the end of the runway with 463 people in 375 seats. We had people sitting on the floor, we had people sitting in the lavatories, we had people all over the place. But once we were at the end of the runway waiting for takeoff, and we started our takeoff roll, I felt like I hope we make it, because I knew that just a few miles away were North Vietnamese troops with rockets, and I had visions of worldwide headlines. You know, Pan Am 747 shot down over Vietnam, no survivors.
Many years later, Hollywood came calling and made a film called Last Flight Out. James Earl Jones played Al Topping.
And in this picture, starting from the left side, my wife Jan, that's me, there's James Earl Jones.
A consequential time forever remembered in history, one this former Pan Am station manager will never forget.
Once we had wheels up and we started heading east and we crossed the coastline, I looked out the window and I saw American Navy ships out there, and once I saw that, I could breathe again.
They got a message that I was on that C5A Galaxy that crashed, so they were absolutely devastated after going through the process of adoption.
But a week later, Steve Mark's adoptive parents got a call that he was on the last Pan Am flight out of Saigon on April 24th.
And I was one of 4 babies on that flight.
They met him in San Francisco days later and brought him home to White Rock, just south of Vancouver, Canada.
I have an older brother who's a year and a half older and 2 older sisters, twins, who are 5 years older. And I was really welcomed, of course, into the family and into the community.
His parents became advocates for adoption, helping other families navigate the process after their own adoption of Steve from an orphanage in Saigon.
I don't know the circumstances that I was brought to the orphanage, but when I arrived, I was, very malnourished. Basically, there was 4 kids, 8 sets of documents, but none of it matched. If the immigrations or customs would have checked or looked at the babies, if they matched the documentation, we would have never got in.
The document showed 2 different birth dates.
But I went with November 12th and Nguyen Van Hien as my Vietnamese birth name. I arrived with this teddy bear and we named it Nguyen Van Hien, and I still have it today. He's a little rough for wear right now, but yeah, he's definitely a keepsake from my adoption.
He's been back to Vietnam twice, once in 1997 with his parents, and again in 2023 with his own family.
And it was absolutely amazing for my children to see, a bit of their heritage and my birth country. We managed to go to the orphanage where I was in Saigon. We chatted with a sister there, or a nun there, and she claimed she was there when I was there.
Steve's parents encouraged him to explore his own culture.
But then just being in the country and thinking, everyone of sort of similar age, that could have been me. There's always that what if. Adoption starts with loss, right? Loss of your birth family, your birth mother, your culture. It's different for every adoptee, but I do feel very fortunate for my situation because I don't know what it would have been like if I had stayed in Vietnam.
What I found out was we're all like miracle babies that all have an individual story.
He was just a baby who narrowly escaped the C-5 crash in Saigon. How this adoptee is now giving back to the community he once called home. And
if my parents didn't adopt me, I probably wouldn't be here today.
How an orphan boy left on the streets of Vietnam now has a home and a lifetime of memories thanks to an American war photographer.
You've seen for yourself the flood of Americans going out. As a matter of fact, I think you probably also know today is what I call a popular day for missions. The Germans have gone, the Canadians have gone also today.
Jason Kaiser was orphaned as an infant in Vietnam in 1974. He was actually placed on that very first Operation Babylift plane, but narrowly escaped death because they removed him from the flight moments before takeoff. They said he was too severely ill to fly. He did eventually make it to the United States and was adopted by a loving family. And nowadays he does return to Ho Chi Minh City often, not only to search for birth relatives, but also because of a charity he started that involves this coffee shop.
Rise Coffee Studio in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam is not just about waking up to caffeine. It's about second chances.
It has a couple of meanings. So the first meaning is that, every day you rise up. But another meaning is because our programs is to help orphans and being lifted up.
An Nguyen, who runs the shop, says each cup served helps Vietnamese orphans build a better future.
To move forward in life.
When you came to the orphanage, October 28, 74.
And it's all because of this Vietnamese orphan's past.
These are pictures that they actually sent over to my American parents before I came to say, hey, you really do have a son. Here he is, and He's doing all right.
9,000 miles away near Charlotte, North Carolina, Jason Kaiser dreamed up Rise Coffee Shop after he got a second chance a half-century ago.
And I always knew that my life had some meaning to it.
At the tail end of a war that upended his country, Jason's future was in jeopardy.
These other pictures were other photos from the orphanage.
He never knew his birth parents. Just a baby, he was taken to an orphanage in Saigon as thousands were trying to flee the war zone. A group of Catholic nuns were taking care of him.
My name there in the orphanage was Lysander because we all looked the same, so they named us after a Shakespearean play.
Jason was set to be evacuated on the Air Force cargo jet that crashed in a rice paddy just outside Saigon. But medical staff pulled him off moments before takeoff. He was too sick to fly.
And I've talked to a lot of other orphans, not just from Vietnam, over the years, and it is this sort of somewhat survivor syndrome. Why did I survive and not everybody else? And what I found out was just we're all like miracle babies that all have an individual story, and we got over here in very different circumstances.
Jason finally did make it to the U.S. a couple of weeks later and into the home of his adopted family, surrounded by love.
I was sandwiched in between two redheads, and our community was mainly Caucasian, so I was one of the only 4 minorities in the community.
Around the time he was in high school, the inner turmoil that's plagued other orphans and adoptees began to set in. Questions about who he was and who his birth parents were.
Why did they give me up? Those thoughts get into your mind and kind of swirl around.
He started to rebel.
That was a low point, thoughts of suicide. It's like, well, what does it matter?
That's when the only parents he's ever known set him on a new path. He started leaning into the faith instilled in him from day one of his adoption.
The Lord knew that he needed to take me through these low points to get me to the next part of my life.
Now he's been married for 27 years and has 4 beautiful children, a redefined family.
The most different experience as an orphan that I had was when I had my first son. When Adam came out, I kind of thought to myself, hey, this is the first biological connection I have in this world that I know of, right?
And what came next was a successful business career in IT and coffee CEO.
And so I started doing more research on my Vietnam heritage, started going to Vietnam more often.
So this is our supervisor.
So he turned his passion into purpose. He and his brother had the idea to set up businesses around the world, employing orphans in order to give them new opportunities.
Right now we have programs in Ukraine, and then Uganda, Africa. And then last year we started a coffee shop in Vietnam.
So great products, purposeful impact.
A second chance.
I see in their eyes what maybe should have been me.
Thanks to someone who got his own second chance so many years ago.
And to know that I can do a little bit to give back, it's just a good feeling to know that my life is kind of full circle.
At the end of the war, they were flying as many orphanage kids and babies as they could out of the region. It says my name, Vietnamese. It says Nguyen Van Cong.
Ben Johnson was one of them. He was 13 months old, bloated, with bumps all over his body.
Because I was so malnourished, I was quarantined for a little longer than the average. I just know that I flew in from Vietnam to Oregon.
Ben's final stop was Flint, Michigan.
Life was good. My mom was a respiratory nurse for a long time, and then she got her RN license, and my dad he worked for GM, right here, 8th grade. I still had ongoing health issues growing up, so I was in and out of the hospitals a lot.
Ben was rebellious.
By the age of 9, I was drinking beer and cigarettes. So as the years progressed, I got into the bigger and harder drugs. In 91-ish, I think I got diagnosed with testicular cancer.
He had emergency surgery to remove the cancer.
So then they started giving me opiates for the pain. And then I just got hooked on it.
Things began to spiral even more.
But I got track marks from here, here.
He went through 18 treatment centers and wound up behind bars.
I was close to doing a 14-year prison bit.
But he's come out the other side and has been clean for 11 years. Now Ben is turning around the lessons he learned and giving back to those in need.
We go into treatment centers, county jails, prisons, and we talk to people that's been in the crapper where I was.
So cute.
He now lives in Florida with his wife Wanda.
And look, I was still wearing Harley Davidson back there.
Oh my goodness.
For Ben Johnson, home is America, and Vietnam?
Going over there just to step foot on Vietnamese land and go, yep, been here, done that. I think that's enough for me.
He always took pictures of everything.
When your dad is a professional photographer who's worked for newspapers and National Geographic, you can count on thousands of life's moments being captured on film.
He built a darkroom in his basement, so he's always had us in there helping him develop his films. He kind of pushed photography on us, and my brother and sister, they went into photojournalism.
His photojournalist dad, David, was there to document it all, even the moment John stepped off an airplane from Vietnam, an orphan no more.
So they wanted a bigger family, and they said, hey, there's a lot of kids that need to be adopted, so that's how I came about. And then Beth, they adopted too. She came later.
John was born in Vietnam. He never knew his birth father, who was likely an American GI fighting the war, or his birth mother, a Vietnamese woman. According to the story John's always been told, he was abandoned along the side of the road somewhere in Vietnam.
Me and I think 2 other kids that were a little older.
Mercifully, while out on patrol, some American soldiers happened to find him and the 2 other kids on that roadside.
So it was just a couple of us on the side of the road that the GIs happened to stumble across during the patrol. And they took us, because we were abandoned, and took us to a nun that they knew had an orphanage, and from there the nun took us to the orphanage.
Had they not found him, the chances of him finding a home and family in Vietnam weren't great.
If my parents didn't adopt me, I probably wouldn't be here today.
During and after the Vietnam War, an estimated 100,000 so-called Amerasian children were born. Kids born to Vietnamese mothers and American soldiers, almost always left behind when U.S. troops returned home from war and rejected in a country where they didn't look like everyone else.
They had more trouble getting adopted and getting fed first. The orphanage was already limited on food, so if there was any food left, rice, water, then we were the last stages of actually being given food.
Thankfully, John wouldn't be in the orphanage for long. When photojournalist David Cupp was on assignment in 1972 taking these photos of orphans in Vietnam, he decided one of them belonged back home in Denver with his family.
Yeah, it was luck of the draw arbitrarily. I mean, they didn't say, yeah, we'll take that one. They didn't know what gender I would be. They really just said, hey, we'll take one of the babies that's, in survival mode right now, so.
There were some challenges. He needed paperwork to get over here, but didn't have any.
Since I was abandoned, to come over here, you had to at least have a birth certificate. So there's a lot of babies that unfortunately didn't make it and died, and the ones that were in the hospitals, that's the documentation they attached. So, as a quote-unquote birth certificate.
His papers aren't his own. He doesn't even know his actual birthday.
It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because I came in a loving family, and being told something different, that, hey, this is actually, what it transpired when you were a baby. It's good knowledge, but it's not, it doesn't define me,
If anything, John's childhood experiences inspired him. It was the story of those American soldiers who found him on the side of the road as a baby that motivated him to join the Army himself, where he spent more than 2 decades serving his country.
I've always been a patriotic person, and so I just recently retired like 2 years ago.
He was also inspired by his dad, who died a couple of years ago, but whose photos will forever tell the story of a loving family brought together by, of all things, the Vietnam War.
And I have more of an appreciation of both of them now. Probably 20 years ago, I really opened up and I then said, hey, I really appreciate how good of human beings you guys are and, what you've actually done. Yeah, I was a lucky kid.
My mom specifically always told me that I was meant to be her baby, and she was meant to be my mother.
Just a baby, she survived the crash of that C-5A Galaxy out of Saigon. Now, 50 years later, this Vietnam adoptee is on a mission to protect and preserve the story of Operation Babylift.
I can't guarantee that every single South Vietnamese war orphan will get here. I can only say we'll do what has to be done, what can be done as a practical matter.
For her entire lifetime, one woman has been collecting artifacts and personal stories from Operation Babylift, and now, to mark the 50th anniversary, she's opened an exhibit with some of the only photographs and records that exist for many of the adoptees. Some of those mementos tell her story, too.
It's a collective story of all of us.
They share a history so unique, few others outside this room could even imagine it.
This is a book that Bud made about the whole plane crash.
A story Devaki Murch has vowed to protect and preserve, the story of Operation Babylift.
What he said is, I don't want history to disappear when I disappear.
At the opening reception for this new exhibit at Regis University in February, Murch debuted the artifacts she spent a lifetime curating.
It's really amazing to see it all up and out. Yeah. It's not as scary as I thought.
Detailing the bold and historic effort to get her and thousands of other orphaned Vietnamese children out of that country during the war. The heartbreaking plane crash that killed dozens of those children, and the new life in a new land awaiting those who did make it out.
A lot of this collection is gifts. All of this stuff was in boxes at home. And so as I'm going through it, it was amazing to bring it all out and find that it had a place.
Few know the story better than Devaki. She lived it.
You know, I survived a plane crash.
Just a 9-month-old baby, she was on board that first flight out of Saigon.
This picture is the cargo compartment. When the plane landed, it landed on the cargo compartment.
All of these older children, seated in the cargo area at the bottom of the plane, perished when the belly of the plane hit the ground and skidded for a quarter mile in a rice paddy near the airport.
When they were loading the babies, they would put a pillow, then a baby, then a pillow, then or two babies, then a pillow, then two babies, and just strap them all in.
But the young babies, like Devaki, strapped in the upper portion of the cabin, made it out alive. Most of the adoptees' records were destroyed as well. In fact, aside from this baby photo and a few papers, Devaki had no details about her birth or her birth parents.
I don't have a hospital bracelet. I don't have a little lock of hair when I came home. What I have are front page New York Times articles, and I have survival manifests. That's my baby records.
Over the years, she and other adoptees have collected pictures, news reports, and passenger lists, helping piece together their story.
This is the only existing history for all of these children, and myself included.
While sifting through some of the boxes kept by a Colorado-based adoption agency called Friends for All Children, one file folder in particular caught her by surprise.
Grabbed the top one, opened it up, and I went, "Mommy!" And it was my mother's handwriting.
They were letters she was seeing for the very first time, detailing the efforts her adoptive parents went through to make her their own.
It had my mother's handwriting, because it's very, very, very distinct, and my whole dossier on the right side. It tracked the entire story before I became my parents' child, before I existed in their arms, in that folder. And there are these letters from my mother who wanted a baby.
Reading those letters now.
We would like to be put on your waiting list to adopt a baby. We want to adopt a baby as close to newborn as possible, either male or female of any racial background. We want a healthy baby, but are open to any kinds of correctable illnesses.
It's clear to Devaki she wound up with the family she was destined to join.
My mom specifically always told me that I was meant to be her baby, and she was meant to be my mother.
She plans to create a traveling exhibition showing these artifacts around the country. She wants everyone to learn about the unprecedented effort to save a lost generation of children.
When you're dealing with humans, you're dealing with sensitive emotions, you're dealing with history, is you really, really need to do it properly.
Next, orphans evacuated from Saigon during Operation Babylift return to Vietnam to remember.
When you left this city, there were folks on the other side of the Pacific who were longing to hold you in their arms.
Sister Marinelle and a group of adoptees actually just returned here to Ho Chi Minh City, an emotional journey to mark 50 years since the fall of Saigon, since that plane crash, since Operation Babylift. A chance for them to catch up and see just how much Saigon has changed and how much their lives have changed in a half-century.
We gather on this holy ground to honor the children, the caretakers, and the Air Force personnel whose lives on this earth ended 50 years ago.
It was an effort like none other attempted before. Thousands of lives changed all over the world. An operation that made heroes of nuns and nurses, pilots and volunteers, each with the common goal of protecting the youngest victims of the Vietnam War and keeping them out of harm's way through Operation Babylift. Thank you for watching. I'm Jeremy Hubbard in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Good night.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.